Most people think they know everything about this photo. The white dress, the grate, the wind, the laugh. It's probably the most recognized image in Hollywood history. What most people don't talk about is what was happening just off camera. Joe DiMaggio was there that night, watching the whole thing from the crowd. By some accounts, he was furious. Not performing anger, actually furious. The marriage didn't last another year after this. This photo that the whole world fell in love with was quietly killing something at the same time. This is before any of it. Norma Jean Dougherty, 18 years old, standing on a street in Los Angeles, married to a man named Jim Dougherty, who she barely knew. She'd been placed in the marriage to avoid going back into the foster system. That smile is real. She's not performing anything here. Nobody had told her yet what she was supposed to become. 7 years after that street photo, she's on a test stage at Fox with cameras on her and men in directors' chairs deciding her future. The clapperboard in the foreground says it all. She's being evaluated. What's striking is how completely in control she looks in a situation designed to make people feel the opposite. That was always the thing about her. Best Actress in a Comedy. She won this the same year the studio was telling press she was difficult, unprofessional, impossible to work with. She knew exactly what she was doing. They just didn't like that she knew. This is one of my favorite stories in Hollywood history, and I'll tell you why. When Frank Sinatra was with Ava Gardner, he was not at the top. His career was genuinely in trouble. The voice was giving out. The records weren't selling. The studio had dropped him. Ava was the bigger name. She's the one who went to bat for him to get the role in From Here to Eternity, the role that turned everything around. He won the Oscar. The marriage fell apart around the same time. I've always found that timing difficult to look at squarely. America's Sweethearts. That's genuinely how they were described. He was the singer everyone's mother loved. She was the girl next door from Singin' in the Rain. And together, they were exactly what Hollywood wanted to put on the cover of every magazine. 3 years after this was taken, he left her for Elizabeth Taylor, who had been her closest friend. The story went through every living room in the country. By the time this was taken in London, they had already become the most talked about couple on earth, and they'd earned that designation the hard way. The Cleopatra scandal had been front-page news for 2 years. Both of them had been married to other people when it started. What I find interesting, looking at this photo, is how ordinary it looks. Two people near the Thames, almost nose to nose, like they're just two people and not an international event. That's what it must have felt like from the inside, I suppose. Between the marriages, between the scandals, between the productions. Just a woman sitting in her own house. That look in her eyes is one I've never quite been able to read. Two of the most magnetic screen presences of their generation in the same frame, in a scene about a marriage that has completely broken down. The tension in this photo is real. Tennessee Williams wrote the material, but these two brought something that went beyond what was on the page. In my opinion, this is Taylor's single best performance. Not Butterfield 8, not Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. This one. And then there's this. The same Paul Newman, in his own kitchen, dancing with his wife, looking like nobody's watching because nobody is. Newman and Woodward were together for 50 years. in an industry that treated marriages as publicity material. They treated theirs like it was none of your business. I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Before Roman Holiday, before Sabrina, before any of it, she's sitting at a drugstore counter in New York, drinking coffee completely alone, while she's doing the Broadway run of Gigi. Nobody's bothering her. Nobody's taking her picture for a reason. This was just a candid. What strikes me is that she looks genuinely at ease, which is harder than it sounds when you know what was coming. 3 years after that diner counter, she's on a film set in an oversized blazer, mid-step, looking like she owns the place. The transformation is total. But honestly, I prefer the diner. The story everyone knows about this film is Moon River. And fine, that's fair. But what gets overlooked is what Audrey Hepburn was actually doing in this role. Holly Golightly, as written by Truman Capote, was a specific kind of person that the studio was nervous about putting on screen. Hepburn made her sympathetic without softening her. That's a harder thing to do than it looks in the finished film. Two people sharing a teacup on the set of a Hitchcock film. Danny Kaye had just stopped by all accounts. Grace Kelly looks completely relaxed, which is something, because Hitchcock's sets were not known for being relaxed places. She had a quality on camera that very few people have ever matched. She looked like she was thinking something you weren't allowed to know. This was the last Hollywood film she made, before she became Princess Grace of Monaco. The year after this was taken, she was gone. Not dead, just gone, in the way that felt almost as permanent. She gave up the career entirely when she married Prince Rainier. For years I've heard people say she got a fairy tale ending. Maybe. But she was one of the most gifted film actresses who ever lived, and she spent the last 26 years of her life not making movies. I'm still not fully sure how to feel about that. The crowd reaching toward her, hands everywhere, and she's got one arm raised and she's laughing. What's easy to forget about Sophia Loren is how completely she won over Italian audiences before Hollywood ever got involved. She wasn't discovered by Americans. She was already a star. Hollywood just noticed eventually, which is a different thing. On set of Boccaccio 70, standing on a carousel, and the entire crew behind her has completely stopped what they were doing. She has that quality where the camera almost doesn't know what else to do but find her. De Sica directed this segment. He understood something about her that took other directors longer to figure out. These two at a premiere, laughing like they're the only people in the room. Kirk Douglas had that effect on people. So did she. The room had no idea what to do with both of them at once. Sharon Tate, 1968, her own home in Los Angeles. 12 months after this was taken, she was gone. That window behind her, that quiet. The year before that photo, she was here, on the set of Valley of the Dolls, in the middle of what looked like a real career in the making. She'd gotten solid notices, the roles were getting better, and people who worked with her consistently said the same thing, that she was more talented than the material she'd been given so far. She was still figuring out what she could do. Two people who arrived at Cannes as co-stars and left as two entirely separate phenomena. Kirk Douglas was already established. Bardot was 20 at the time of this promotion, and the French press was still trying to figure out exactly what she was. Within 3 years, the entire world would be having that argument. He later said she was one of the most naturally magnetic people he'd encountered on screen. Barefoot on the streets of Capri, completely unbothered by the crowd forming behind her. That's not a performance of not caring. She genuinely did not care. That was the whole thing. Some of these next stories are ones I've been sitting on for a while. Pay attention. By the time this was taken at the Plaza, Bardot had already retired from acting. She was in her late 30s, which, by the logic of Hollywood, was considered the end of something. She disagreed. She spent the rest of her life as an animal rights activist, which is either a footnote or the main story depending on how you look at it. People forget this. Natalie Wood and Elvis Presley were briefly, genuinely together in 1956. She was 17, he was 21, and both of them were in the middle of becoming something the culture had never quite seen before. The story goes that her studio was nervous about the association. Elvis was considered too wild, too working class, not the right image for their contract player. I've read different versions of what happened between them, and none of them fully add up. But looking at this photo, whatever it was real. 6 years after the Elvis photograph, she's in Rome with Warren Beatty, who was then one of the most relentlessly pursued men in Hollywood. They were supposedly together for a period around this time, though both of them were characteristically quiet about the details. What I find interesting about this photo is how purposefully they seem to be walking, like they're going somewhere specific and the cameras can follow or not. Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, 1969. She's laughing at something. This was taken the same year she was killed. That smile. On set, mid-scene, completely committed to a physical gag that most leading ladies of her era would have passed on entirely. She always did the thing you didn't expect. That was the best part of watching her. 3 years later, walking through a studio lot like she owns it, in this perfectly composed outfit designed for Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. By 1968, Natalie Wood had already been famous for 20 years. She'd started as a child actress. What strikes me about this period of her career is how much confidence had replaced whatever anxiety was there before. She looks like she finally figured something out. They were married for 3 years, which sounds short until you realize that for Orson Welles, 3 years of actual commitment was something. The Mocambo was the club in those days. If you were photographed there, you were somewhere. Rita Hayworth was the bigger star at this point, which Welles understood and by most accounts, genuinely admired rather than resented. That's rarer than it sounds in this business. This film changed American cinema, and everyone involved knew it while they were making it. The studio did not know it. They tried to bury the release. The story of how Bonnie and Clyde got seen by anyone is almost as interesting as the film itself. Faye Dunaway was 26 years old in this photo. She looks like she's been doing this for 40 years. That's what the right role does. This is one of the stranger corners of Hollywood history that doesn't get talked about enough. Father Yod, born James Edward Baker, ran a health food restaurant on Sunset that became the center of a full commune. He had 13 wives. He made psychedelic records. He died hang gliding in Hawaii. The story of the Source family is one I've never seen properly told anywhere, and it deserves to be. 3 people on a film shoot in Hong Kong, and Roger Moore looks exactly like you'd expect Roger Moore to look in Hong Kong in 1974. Some photographs are exactly what they appear to be. This is one of those. This was early Jane Fonda, before the politics, before Clute, before everything that came later defined how people thought about her. In 1962, she was still figuring out what kind of actress she wanted to be, and you can see it here. There's something unresolved in this frame that became very resolved about 5 years later. The talent was always there. The direction took time. Last stretch. Some of the best ones are still ahead. What I find genuinely remarkable about Sonny and Cher is how many times they reinvented the act. By 1973, the music career had cooled, and the TV show had become the thing, and they were bigger than ever. Then the marriage ended, and Cher became something else entirely on her own. Sonny went into politics. I've never fully made sense of the full trajectory of what those two were to each other. Gainsbourg was not a conventionally attractive man, and he was the first to say so. Jane Birkin was 22 when this was taken, and by every objective standard was one of the most beautiful women in Europe. What they had between them was one of those relationships that confounded everybody who tried to explain it from the outside. The only explanation that works is that it just worked. Same year, Cannes. She's standing on a boat looking like she invented the decade. He's sitting below her looking like he knows something everyone else is still figuring out. Two of the most written about women in film history, meeting for the first time at an English airport. Vivien Leigh was already a 2-time Oscar winner. Monroe was in England to make The Prince and The Showgirl with Laurence Olivier, Leigh's husband. The story goes that the set was difficult, that Olivier and Monroe clashed constantly. Leigh apparently found the whole situation privately amusing. I believe that completely. Steve McQueen at home in his kitchen, holding his wife. Not the movie star, not the rebel, just a man in a house. The thing people don't always register about McQueen is that behind all of it, there was someone who'd had a genuinely hard early life and had clawed his way to exactly this moment. This photo is what that looks like from the inside. Alain Delon at the height of his European stardom, and Natalie beside him at a premiere. The two of them leaning toward each other in conversation while the rest of the room does what it does. They divorced not long after this. The French press treated the whole thing as a national event, which tells you something about how seriously France took Alain Delon. Three of the most recognizable faces in European cinema, all in the same convertible at Cannes in 1962. Romy Schneider and Delon had been together, and that relationship was already complicated by this point. Sophia Loren had just won the Academy Award the previous year for Two Women. And yet what strikes me about this photograph is how young they all look. Schneider especially. She had the kind of face that held everything in. She died at 43. This photo is almost unbearable to look at if you know what's coming. The year before, the Cannes photo. The Seine at night, her head against his shoulder. They were together for several years. It was the kind of romance that the European press treated almost as mythology while it was happening. When it ended, the accounts of why it ended never quite agreed. Maybe that's appropriate. Some things don't have a clean explanation, and trying to find one misses the point. He had a tattoo on his arm that said Winona Forever. After they broke up, he had it altered to read Wino Forever, which tells you something about either his sense of humor or his capacity for self-protection. Probably both. This photograph was taken for British Vogue during what was, by all accounts, a genuinely intense relationship. What strikes me now, knowing everything that came afterward, the years, the trials, all of it, is how completely present they both look in this moment. Whatever happened later, this was real. Ingrid Bergman had been effectively exiled from Hollywood for most of the 1950s after her affair with Roberto Rossellini became public. America turned on her in a way that was genuinely severe. There were speeches on the Senate floor. By 1959, when this was taken with her daughter Pia, the storm had passed. That hug in this photo carries the weight of everything that came between them during those years. Lauren Bacall and her daughter Leslie Bogart, walking through Paris 11 years after Humphrey Bogart died. I keep coming back to this photograph. Bacall was 43 when this was taken, still striking, still completely herself. And there is something in how she moves through that street that I find harder to describe than almost anything else in this set. She had the kind of dignity that doesn't come from standing still. It comes from having been through something that could have broken you and deciding, with full awareness, not to let it. What do you carry with you that still connects you to someone you've lost?